What if what we call public opinion was just a manufactured narrative that makes it easier to convince people that if their views are different, then there's something wrong with that, or there's something wrong with them?
Spending is a tax. As soon as the government spends money, eventually it's a tax. Sometimes we put a direct tax on the people, sometimes we borrow the money, and sometimes we print the money.
Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth.
The Patrick Riggins Show. And now your host, Patrick Riggins.
Yes. So welcome to the Patrick Riggins Show. For those of you who were growing up back in the 1980s when MTV was playing actual music videos, you should remember this song. For the guys in the listening audience, you can probably recall watching the girls in music videos like this one and thinking, hey, wow, the girls really dress that way? Do they really dance like that? And more importantly, where can a 12-year-old meet them? Nowadays, they're as close as the internet, or your just graduated teacher in fifth period English. It seems like every other week we're reading about some teacher sleeping with a student. I hate to sound old, but back when I was a kid, you didn't have a shot at anything like that. The best you could do was dreaming over scantily clad girls and hair metal band videos. That was it. Then when you got older, you found out girls really didn't dress like that. They didn't dance half naked in the rain, except in music videos. I know, bummer. But it's fun to relive some of the memories through the music popular back then, back in the 80s. Ronald Reagan, the World's Fair, MTV, gigantic cell phones. But before we get lost in reminiscing and forget why we're here today, let me thank you again for tuning in and listening to one of the fastest growing radio shows on the dial today. Of course, that's the Patrick Riggins Show, the premier attraction of the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network. If you're listening here locally in Knoxville, you're hearing us live on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. You can also listen over the station's streaming internet feed at newstalk987.com. That's newstalk987.com. All right. So what do you say we turn the music down and get started? I know it's fun listening, but I have a lot of stuff to get to, and there are stations all over the dial playing music. But don't go listen to them now. Stay here until this show's over, and then you can start punching buttons on the radio. This week, we've had all these memorials during 9/11, and that's good. But what's changed since then? We've got even more intrusive government. We've got the TSA, the Department of Homeland Security. We've got the NSA and other assorted governmental agencies spying on us. Is this a good thing? Is this the legacy that these people would want? Do you think if we ask them, hey, do you mind if the United States government uses your death in a terrorist attack to take the opportunity to limit the freedom of your fellow citizens and start spying on everything they do? How many of those people who died would agree to that? In all of these memorials, all this piety on how we won't forget, yet we do. We have forgotten what we had before 9/11. It wasn't much more freedom, but it certainly was more than we have now. Each 9/11, we allow the government to reinforce their reasoning on why we have to give up our freedom. Things have changed. The world's changed. That's how it's sold to us. And each year we are willingly led in chains further and further away from our true American ideals of freedom for every person. 9/11 has been bastardized into this rallying cry for more government intervention, more spying, more sticking our noses into other countries' business, more chasing the terrorists. Unfortunately, the general population doesn't think about all of this. They're all caught up in participating in the moment, being part of the crowd. I care. I'm a good and caring citizen because I cry during these ceremonies. I put pictures of the Twin Towers on my Facebook page. Always right below it, I'll never forget. We've got millions of bikers going to Washington, D.C. to counter-protest a Muslim protest. Millions of them riding for hours to get to the Capitol. Yet, the NSA is still spying on Americans. The CIA is violating the rights of human beings all around the world, killing innocent people through drone strikes and calling it collateral damage. Where's the protest for that? I'll ask again. Would the people who were murdered on 9/11 agree with their deaths being used to promote this tyrannical agenda by our own government? Would they agree with people protesting the Muslim protest while massive constitutional violations by our government are being given a pass? Edward Snowden, I hate to be morbid, but he's for all intents and purposes dead. He can't return to this country. He can't even go to any country that might send him back here. What kind of life is he going to have? Can you imagine giving up your life, everything you have right now, to reveal to the American people what our government has been doing behind our backs? Where are the people riding to Washington, D.C. to protest the government treating a whistleblower like this? Where are the people thanking him for giving up everything he had just to let us know our government is violating our rights? Look, I understand what a lot of people are feeling, but therein lies the problem. The government loves it when you are feeling, but not when you're thinking. Your feelings can be much more easily manipulated than your logical thinking. That's how a lot of this overbearing legislation gets passed. When do they try to pass gun control? It's when there's a shooting. When your feelings are taking over your logical thinking. When you won't stop to think about if this is taking away your freedom or not. I'm not saying you shouldn't remember those who died on 9/11. What I'm saying is, don't allow the government to, tack on amendments limiting your freedom to the events of that day. Just like they do with important legislation in Congress. Representatives will tack on amendments for their pet projects because the main bill is too important not to pass. Same thing here. 9/11 evokes a lot of emotions, and the government plays off those by tacking on these quotes like, "We'll pursue the terrorists around the world," which means we'll be sending our soldiers to fight in frivolous wars. They'll say, like, no price is too great to ensure the safety of Americans, which means you'll be losing more of your freedom. We have to do what we can to prevent another 9/11. That means pretty much the same thing. Less freedom and liberty for you. Do you see how this works? We take a highly charged emotional event, 9/11, and link it to fighting terrorists and allowing the spying that supposedly catches them. And if you ask if more spying is actually working, well, the government tells you, oh, that's a secret. We're just supposed to trust them. I point all this out so you can watch for it in your own life. When something is highly emotional, don't make important decisions right then. Stop and think about it for a while. It's the same thing these Feed the Children organizations do. Show you a bunch of starving kids and then ask you to call now to make a donation. I mean, everybody remembers the ASPCA commercials with a sad song playing and images of hopeless and abused dogs and cats. They don't play that commercial and then ask you to send money in a few weeks. They tell you, only by acting now can you change things. Only by acting now can we do what's necessary. Same thing with 9/11. The Patriot Act was passed a little over 6 weeks after that date. 6 weeks was all Congress needed to pass this unconstitutional and overwhelmingly tyrannical legislation. Yet, year after year, they can't get a budget passed through the House and the Senate. So when emotions are high, that's when they act to get things passed you wouldn't normally agree with. All right, we are up on the first break of the Patrick Regan Show. This week, we'll have even more ideas and issues to stimulate your brain and get you to thinking about the world. We'll get started after these important messages from the sponsors helping to bring you this show. Welcome back for another big segment of the Patrick Regan Show. Another 12 minutes. Oh, I'm getting tripped up there. Another 12 minutes or so of unbridled reason and logical argument. The only question is, are you ready to accept it? Are you ready to think for yourself? Are you ready to take on the responsibilities that true American freedom and liberty bring with it? The good news is that, well, even if you're not ready, this radio show can help you prepare, help you get ready. We're here every week on the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network and locally on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. Tune in every week, and before you know it, you'll be a freedom-loving and liberty-seeking American citizen ready to help educate your fellow Americans about true American ideals. Speaking of this radio show, I frequently have people mention that I should address one minority group or another, or that I'm leaving this or that group out when I mention something. What I tell them is, I address all Americans. I don't separate people into different groups because it's illogical. After all, what is the definition for putting someone into one racial group or another? It used to be that if you had one drop of black blood in you, you were black. Well, also, to be considered for membership into an Indian tribe, a lot of them require you to be at least 1/4 Indian blood. I mean, 1/4? I mean, come on, just because my grandmother was Indian, somehow my blood is different than someone else? We got away from this garbage when we left England. I think it's sad that, speaking of England, that people think just because you were born into a royal family that somehow you're better than everyone else. That for some reason, we need to pay you for the privilege of living among us. That your mere presence among us mortals is worth all the taxes the English people pay to support this extended family. If one of them becomes pregnant, the whole world stops to see if they're going to be a boy or girl. How is the royal couple doing? This whole time, no one is stopping to think about this logically. No one is wondering, hey, why are we having to support or to work to support these people? Yet they continue to do it. We have people, and unfortunately it's in an unnerving number, in fact, that follow all of this stuff from this country, who practically worship that so-called royal family. How insane is that? Do we humans have some need to put people in power over us? Do we have some innate desire, some biological drive to anoint people kings over ourselves? To say, yes, just because they're from a certain family, they're better than the rest of us. If you're out there listening to this show and having your perception of the royal family shattered, well, then good, it needed to be. I apologize for having to be the one to do it, but it needed to be done. So we've established how ridiculous it is to separate people based on their bloodline. Then, if that's so, why do we allow it to continue in this country? We let the government tell us, well, you're black and you're white and you're Hispanic, when after all the intermarrying going on, it really doesn't matter. The definitions you're using no longer really apply. We just had this nation celebrating Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Now, for some black leaders, it was a chance to try and increase their power and increase their paychecks and increase the governmental aid they can deliver to their constituencies. I guess in that sense, they're really no different than people in Congress doling out pork projects for the people back home who support them. In both cases, they're paying off people to keep them in power. But back to my point, though. Martin Luther King said, and we've all heard it, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What he was talking about was not dividing people into different categories. It doesn't matter. We're all Americans. The government isn't just spying on white people. It's spying on all of us. The government isn't just sending black people to fight in a foreign country for people who don't care whether we live or die. They're sending all races. The government isn't just taxing Asians and Hispanics, then giving the money to other citizens as charity. It's doing that to all of us. Did you ever notice when it comes to punishing the successful through higher taxes, then the government doesn't really care what color you are? As long as you make above a certain amount of money, then you're getting heavily taxed. That brings up another point. When you buy something in the store, you have to pay sales tax, but it doesn't matter what color you are. You see, the government only categorizes Americans into race when it can benefit itself. When it comes to screwing you over, it has no problem treating us all the same. This is what we need to get away from. As I just stated, the definitions are so fuzzy that they don't apply anymore. Just look at the president. He claims he's black, but you can make the equal claim that he's white. It shouldn't matter, but for a lot of people it does. Look at our presidential picks over the last few years. It seems as if only certain families can qualify to lead us. We're getting right back to this whole royal bloodline BS. You mean to tell me we always have to pick from a few families to be president or to sit in Congress? We had Bush, Clinton, Bush. Now we're talking about Clinton again. We had Obama in there to kind of throw us a curve. But is this all we have? These are our royal families? We have to separate ourselves from this corrupted type of thinking that certain people and families are the only ones qualified to be in government. Yet, when I talk to a lot of people, they don't see any problem with this. In fact, I think a lot of citizens of this country yearn for a royal family just like Britain has. They want to romanticize about the prince and princess. They want to pay for their royal lifestyles, even when their own lives are just scraping by. That's why we've essentially created royalty in Hollywood. We have these people who hang on everything these stars do. They watch the gossip shows. They read about it in magazines. They live their lives vicariously through this substitute royalty because we don't have a state-sanctioned royalty in this country. When someone does come along in government, they can put on a pedestal and constantly reelect no matter what. They jump on the chance. This is what I want to make sure you're watching out for in your own life. Now, most of you listening probably don't have this problem, but I would wager a few of you do or harbor feelings in that direction. Make sure you aren't putting people, these mere humans, on pedestals because they'll always disappoint. They're human. That's what we frequently do. We let other people down. It isn't on purpose. It's because others have put us on high, and when we act human, we come crashing down in their eyes. So what's the solution? We have to move away from this glorification of all things government. We have to stop looking to government for all the answers and start looking to ourselves and our communities. Government has all but destroyed that. Communities taking care of their own. Government has stepped in and broken us all apart, divided us up, all for the sake of its own power and money. Why do you think it is both government representatives and so-called minority leaders, they try so hard to make you hate another race, to make you think someone else is getting an advantage just because they're different than you or that they're preferred over you? When you start hearing this type of thing, remember, these people are all the same. If anyone is getting an advantage over you, it's those leaders. It's whoever's telling you you need to follow them, that they're watching out for you. How many times have you seen reported the sweetheart deals these people get in Washington or any place in government? How long are you going to continue to believe that line of bull? I mean, do you enjoy being manipulated or being a puppet to these people who are draining the very life, very freedom out of you in this country? A lot to think about. And we are up on the half-hour break here on the Patrick Riggin Show. When we come back, we'll have a little bit more here on the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network and News Talk 98.7 WOKI. What do we have coming up here? Oh, we'll talk about conservatives, and this may get some people's goat here in this audience, but we'll talk about conservatives and how some of them are really wolves in sheep's clothing. So join us for that and even more in the second half hour of the show.
I got myself undressed. I ain't ready for the... Tell me something.
Welcome back. Listening to some funky music there. I'll tell you something good. We're winning. Libertarian thought it's really starting to catch on here in America, and there's no better place to experience it than right here on the Patrick Riggin Show and the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network, which you can also hear locally every Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern on right here, News Talk 987 WOKI. All right, this segment, I want to remind you of something that I talked about last year on this show. I warned you about all these people, well, jumping on the so-called libertarian bandwagon. How all of these popular conservative talk show hosts on both radio and television they're talking a good game, but if you listen closely, you'll hear that they're not as pro-government, or they're as pro-government intrusion as well as any liberal is. Now, right around that same time, also demonstrated to you with these people's own words how prominent conservatives like, well, Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter, how they feel about true individual freedom and liberty by playing what they think of libertarians. If you want to listen to any of that, after the show, pop over to our radio archives at youtube.com/Patrick Riggin Show. But I told you how these conservatives feel about letting you make your own decisions in your life. Now, in a few words, they don't mind as long as you're making decisions they agree with. Well, you can add one more name to that growing number of people, these quasi-libertarians who are mixing in libertarian catchphrases and talking points, well, I think to boost their audience numbers. These people have consultants who tell them which way the country is leaning, and these show hosts' job is to jump in front of it and proclaim, hey, I've been here the whole time. And really no different than politicians claiming they've always been working for the American people. They watch the polls and then all race to use whatever talking points that seem to be popular and attracting a lot of support at the moment. But this next show host, it's one that's really risen to prominence based on his pronouncement that, hey, I'm really a libertarian. I believe in those principles. So you should listen to my show and watch my television network. For those of you who haven't guessed by now, well, it's Glenn Beck. And for the most part, I've pretty much left him alone because he's been preaching a pretty good sermon. Even, I suspected you didn't believe it. The problem is these conservatives will tell you they're libertarian, but then mix in some government solutions to non-existent problems. And people who don't know better start thinking, hey, that's part of libertarian thought as well, when it's not. They'll say, see, I believe all this spying needs to end, but we still need to fight Al-Qaeda wherever we can around the world, especially this last week during the 9/11 memorials. Hey, it sounds good. It makes people think they care, but it isn't getting us closer to true American freedom and liberty. It's just trading one sort of government control for another. And the problem is that governmental control, not one flavor or another, not Democrat or Republican. But anyway, I wanted to play this real quick. Mr. Beck made this announcement about America and then proceeded to make press release after press release to tout this revelation. And here is a quick clip from the show where he mentions that.
We have lost our superpower status this week. Write it down in your calendars, because this is the week that America lost its superpower
And there's
status.
so much respect.
Yeah, he had someone else there jumping in, but he was going on and all about this. And this is all because Russia has taken the lead in getting Syria to turn over its chemical weapons. Not us, but Russia. This has had all the conservative commentators in an uproar, and not just Glenn Beck. They're all screaming how we've lost all of our prestige and credibility in the world, that no one respects us anymore, that all these other countries are laughing at us. And I just have one question for these people. Please tell me where in the Constitution that every one of you have said over and over that you defend, tell me where it says we are to be a superpower and police the rest of the world. Can you find that in there for me, please? Can you find in the Constitution where it says we are supposed to fight for the freedom and liberty of people outside the United States? Sure, it sounds like an admirable goal if you don't think about it too much, if you don't consider all that entails. If you get all caught up with the rah-rah of we're America fighting to free the world from tyrannical rulers. You mean like governments that spy on their citizens? You mean like governments who monitor every aspect of their citizens' lives? You mean like governments who kidnap other human beings from their home countries, ferret them off to an undisclosed location in another part of the world for torture, questioning? That's what those governments refer to as rendition. And see, if you do it, it's called kidnapping. Do you mean like governments who overthrow the democratically elected leaders of other countries if they don't agree with their policies? Oh, wait a minute, I'm describing our country. We're doing those very things. Things we accuse the Russians and Chinese of doing, and they're still doing them. Little tin-horn dictators in African countries. That only happens in those places, not here in the United States. We need to get our own house in order and once again become the beacon on the hill, the shining example of true freedom and liberty, of respect for the rights of all human beings. We used to have that. But as our government has sought to consolidate its power in Washington, our freedoms and liberties have disappeared at an equally rapid and alarming rate. And most Americans sit out there and let it happen. They're watching the puppet show. They're allowing themselves to be entertained while the pickpocket called government works the crowd, taking not only your wallet, but your freedom as well. And just like the puppet show, by the time you realize what you've lost, it's too late to try and get it back. The pickpocket has left the building, leaving you penniless and without freedom. America is almost like a former beauty queen that just hasn't aged real well and sits around talking about her glory days and how beautiful she used to be. And this is the whole problem. We've lost that luster. And the founders of our country didn't want this. We're sitting here not 200 and some odd years later after they've formed this country, and we've allowed it to go to pot. We've allowed our magnificent country to be spoiled by some bad apples. Some people who did things for their best interests and not our country's. Now, I'm not painting all politicians with that same brush. There's probably a handful that tried to do the right thing by our Constitution, but they're few and far in between. That's why it's up to us, the citizens of this great nation, to take back our birthright and get it back to beauty queen status, to once again make it an example of how a free and prosperous country should be. All right, we are up on the last break of the show here this week. We've covered a lot, and we'll get to as much as we can back when we come back in this last short segment. This segment is always just too short. Well, this whole show is, for that matter. When we come back, don't miss a single second here on the Patrick Riggins Show and the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network and News Talk 98.7 WOKI. We'll be back right after these important messages. Oh, yes. Taking it to the streets here on the Patrick Riggins Show. That would be good. see some people pull a little Egypt there and go up there and scream at our leaders a little bit, make them nervous. You're listening to us here, as I just mentioned, on the Patrick Riggins Show. We're the premier show of the Libertarian Lighthouse Radio Network, and here locally on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. Here in this last segment, and I meant to get to this last week, but I didn't have a chance to. I wanted to tell you about an election they had down in Australia. Now, the report ran on the Associated Press and states that, quote, Australia's conservative opposition swept to power Saturday, which, like I said, this was last week. I was wanted to get to this, but they swept to power Saturday, ending 6 years of Labor Party rule and winning over a disenchanted public by promising to end a hated tax on carbon emissions and boost a flagging economy. A victory for the conservative Liberal Party-led coalition comes despite the relative unpopularity of Tony Abbott. He's a 55-year-old former Roman Catholic seminarian and Rhodes Scholar who has struggled to connect with women voters and was once dubbed unelectable by opponents and even some supporters. The article continues, one of the main reasons the Labor Party was defeated was its reneging on an election promise by imposing a deep, unpopular carbon tax on the nation. The swing away from Labor was a resounding rejection of Australia's first minority government since World War II. Voters disliked the deals and compromises struck between Labor, the minor Greens Party, and independent lawmakers to keep their fragile, desperate, or disparate, or it could be desperate, and sometimes chaotic coalition together for the past 3 years, including the carbon tax. You know, is it starting to sound a little familiar? Voters upset over some of the legislation the government was passing and imposing on the citizens, so they end up kicking out these people. Sometimes, this is something I think we're starting to see here in this country. It went on to say, Abbott has vowed to scrap the carbon tax from July 2014, well, that's not right. It must be scrap it during it, because it says 2 years after it was implemented, and instead introduce taxpayer-funded incentives for companies to operate cleaner. It is unclear whether Abbott will be able to pass the necessary law changes through Parliament, but he has threatened to hold early elections if the Senate thwarts him. Now, this is what I've been telling you. People are getting fed up with these government solutions to everything that end up causing more harm than good. Even if Obamacare gets implemented, like this unpopular tax in Australia, we still have a chance to use it to flush out everyone who supported it along with their party if need be. Now, granted, Obamacare is a lot more complicated than a simple carbon tax, but hopefully it'll be the death knell for a lot of politicians' careers. Who knows, we can even replace the two major parties with other ones that would adhere to the Constitution better. You never know, once the citizens of this country, they start getting screwed over by this legislation, what they'll get together and do. The column goes on to say, Australia's new government has promised to slash foreign aid spending as it concentrates on returning the budget to surplus. Labor spent billions of dollars on stimulus projects to avoid recession, but declining corporate tax revenues forced Labor to break a promise to return the budget to surplus in the last fiscal year. So a party sold the same story there that the Democrats and a lot of Republicans sell here. Tax the rich, tax the corporations, spend money on stimulus projects. None of it worked. This is why you need to read the news and try to learn from other countries' mistakes. This is how our founders meant our country to work, that states could try different things, and the successful states could be emulated by the ones that tried something else and it didn't work. We all didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. And this is what we've gotten away from. We have this overbearing, one-solution-fits-all federal government that thinks it knows everything and can fix anything from Washington, D.C. Now, some of our younger listeners won't remember this, but we used to make fun of this same thing occurring in the old Soviet Union. These 5-year plans that would be issued out of Moscow regulating, well, everything. How much grain can be planted, how many beef cattle they can raise, how many cars to produce, everything dictated from Moscow to everyone all across that huge continent. It never worked. There were always shortages and problems with quality. It's because that system doesn't work. We've seen it doesn't. We've made fun of it. I'm making fun of it now. Yet, here we are trying to do the same thing in this country. It all boils down to, look, the more we move back to our original values of American freedom and liberty, the better off we'll be as a country. Now, will it be easy? Well, honestly, no, it won't. There's a whole lot of money to be made off government, and both by people in it and people getting paid for it. And these people aren't going to be real eager to give up their free gravy train. But together working, hopefully we can make a dent in that and start getting this country turned around. And this radio show is my effort to try and get you started in that direction. Speaking of which, we're up on the last of the show here. If you want more information about us, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Patrick Riggin Show. You can also go to our radio archives at youtube.com. Again, Patrick Riggin Show. And can you guess the email address? Hey, it's probably patrickrigginshow@gmail.com. Or you can send a card alert to WOKI here in Knoxville. As we sign off, I want you to remember, liberty begins with you, in your head, in your brain. Join me next Saturday afternoon at 4 when we'll again be fighting for freedom, liberty, and the restoration of the Constitution. Thanks for listening and have a fantastic week.
Expanding the view of the captain and crew like a man.
Join us again next week for a solid dose of truth on the Patrick Riggin Show.